That's right. After a long wait, we're finally going to be building another backend project. And this one is a ton of fun. We're going to build a URL shortener, which is going to have all the works. We're going to have a UI, a backend, a database, absolutely everything you need to get this project 100% done. So let's get started now. After you're done building this project, you're going to need some place to host it. And Atlantic.net, today's video sponsor, is giving you an entire free year of hosting on their servers. And these are some powerful servers that can definitely handle this application and even much more complex applications. All you need to do is use the link in the description below and use the code Kyle when you sign up, and you'll get an additional $50 on top of the year of free server usage. So make sure you check out that link down in the description below to not miss out on this entire year of free hosting. Welcome back to Web Dev Simplified. My name's Kyle, and my job is to simplify the web for you so you can start building your dream projects sooner. So if that sounds interesting, make sure you subscribe to the channel for more videos just like this one. And now to get started, I'm in a completely blank project so I can show you exactly what you need to do step by step. And the first thing we need to do to get started is open up the terminal and actually initialize this folder as an npm project. So let's just drag this up so it's easy to see, and we'll type npm init. And this is going to initialize the folder for us. We're just going to do all the default values, hit enter a bunch of times. And if this throws you an error, make sure you have Node installed. I have a video on that. I'll link in the cards and description down below. And now our next step is to install all the packages we're going to need for this project. I'm just going to get started with the very basic packages, and as we run into needs for other packages, I'll introduce them then. So since we're going to be running an Express server, which is going to have a MongoDB database, we're going to need to install packages related to Express and MongoDB. So if we just type in npm I, this will allow us to install any packages we list afterwards. And we're going to need Express. We're also going to need mongoose, which is for our database, MongoDB. And then we're going to need EJS. This essentially allows us to create our views, our templating language, so we can make our HTML and our backend work together to send useful data down to the browser. And there we go, all of those were installed. And the last thing we need is our dev dependencies. So we should type in npm I --save-dev, and we want to install NodeMon. And what NodeMon is going to allow us to do is to make our server automatically refresh every single time we make changes, because otherwise you have to manually shut the server down and restart it yourself. So with all of that done, we can open up our package.json. You can see all of our dependencies here. And let's just create a simple start script. So we're just going to call this dev start. And this is going to run nodemon server.js. And this is going to start up a file called server.js using nodemon, which means it'll auto refresh for us. So let's save that and create our server.js file. And in here, we can actually put all of the code for our application. So to get our server set up, let's just make the most basic server possible. The first thing we're going to need is that Express library, which we installed just a little bit ago. So let's make sure that we require that library. And if we run the Express function, we're going to get out a variable, which we can use to set up our entire application. So we're just going to put that inside of app. Then with that variable, we can call app.listen. And we just need to pass in the port number we want to listen to. So we're going to use process.env.port. This way, when you deploy your site, you can set the port environment variable and use that. But in development, we're not going to have that variable set. So let's just default to port 5000 instead. And now we can save that. And if we run npm run dev start, you can see that our server is going to start up and it's going to open up on port 5000. Let me just drag in a browser that has port 5000 open. And as you can see, we have our application open and it's saying it cannot get /. Essentially, we have no route defined for our index. So let's just define a simple route. We'll call it app.get. And this is going to be for our index. And this is going to take a function here with request and response variables that are being passed into it. And in here, we want to actually return some index file that we're going to create inside of a folder called views. Now in that folder, we'll just create index.ejs. And the reason we're using .ejs is because that's the templating language we're going to use, and we downloaded that package for handling EJS. So once we have that created, let's just put some placeholder text in here that says hello world so we can see if this works. And in our server, we actually need to set up our views to use the EJS view engine. So what we can do is say app.set, and we want to pass in here view engine because we're going to be setting our view engine. And we need to set this to EJS. That's the view engine that we imported and the one that we're going to use. And then in our app, we can just say here, res, which is our response, we want to render our index file. So we can just say index like this. And if we save and refresh over here, you can see we're getting that text, hello world, being printed out. So we are now rendering everything in our index.ejs out to our browser here. Now the next thing to do is actually to create what we're going to use inside of our index.ejs file. And this index file is going to contain both a form for creating new short URLs, and it's also going to create a list of all of our current short URLs that we have. So let's get started by creating boilerplate HTML with this exclamation point, and we hit enter. And in order to get proper syntax highlighting in this EJS file, when we start going forward and using actual EJS syntax, you're going to want to download an extension here, which is called EJS language support, as you can see at the top. Make sure you have this installed, and that way you properly get the syntax highlighting inside of your EJS file. Let's just shrink that back down. So inside of our EJS file, what we can do is actually put all of the code inside of here for rendering out first that form, as well as the table, which is going to contain all of our different results for the short URLs we've already generated. So first, I want to just have a title for our page. We're going to use an H1, and we're just going to call this URL shrinker. Then we're going to have our form, which is going to have an action, which we're going to handle later, and a method, which in our case is going to be a post method. And inside this form, we need to have an input, which is going to handle our full URL, and then a submit button. So let's create a label, which is going to be for our full URL. And we're just going to come in here, say full URL. And then we're also, actually, let's just make that URL instead. And then we're going to have an input, and this is going to be a type of URL. And we're going to give it a name here of full URL. And we're also going to give it an ID, which is full URL. This is just so our label is linked to our input. Now lastly, we're going to create a button. We're going to make this a submit button. Whoops, submit. And this button is just going to have the text of shrink. Now if we save, refresh our page over here, you can see we have the title, label, input, and then our button for shrink. And right now our form doesn't work, but that's because we haven't set up the backend for it. Now before we get onto the backend, let's actually create the shell for our table, which is going to contain all of our different URLs when we create them. So let's create a table, and inside of here, we want to have a header, and inside of that header, we're going to have a row, which is just going to have 3 different THs, or T headings inside of it, and the first one is going to be for our full URL, and then we're going to have another one, which is going to be for our short URL that we generate, and lastly, we're going to actually track how many times everything was clicked, so we're just going to have another column, which is going to be for our clicks. Then we're going to have a body, and inside that body, we're just going to put a placeholder row for now. So let's just have a single value here, which is just going to be, for example, my own website. So we'll just put an anchor tag here, which has an href to https://courses.webdevsimplified.com. And then we're also just going to put that exact same URL as the text for our anchor tag. And if we save that, refresh our page over here, you can see that showing up inside of our column as our full URL. Now let's do a similar thing, which is going to be another TD, which is going to be for our short URL, and we want an anchor tag in here. And this one instead is going to have an href, which is our shortened version. So it's going to just say, for example, /12345 whatever the shortened URL is, it doesn't really matter right now. And we're going to use that same exact text inside of the anchor tag. And if we refresh, we now have that URL. And then we're going to have a final row in our TD, which is just going to be the number of clicks. We'll say this one has 10 clicks. And as you can see, this is what our table is going to look like. Let's just zoom that out a little bit so it's not quite so scrunched up. There we go, it looks a little bit better. And now in order to style everything inside of this view, instead of writing our own CSS, I'm actually just going to use Bootstrap for this. So make sure you go to Bootstrap's website, getbootstrap.com, go to the download page, and we're just going to use the CDN for importing this into our app instead of downloading it locally. So just copy this first value here for this link tag, that's all we need. And we're just going to paste that into the head. Save, and now we have access to all of the Bootstrap information, which we can use to style our page over here. You can see it's already applied some basic styling. So the first thing I want to do is work on styling out our form. But actually, before we can get to styling the form, let's wrap everything inside of a class called container. And this container is just a Bootstrap class, which allows us to have nice padding and margins and everything between the edge of our page. So we have that container, put everything inside of it, and if we save, refresh, you see that just gives us a little bit of margin and padding, which looks pretty good. Now we can move on to styling our form. So let's add a class here. We're going to use my-4. This is going to add margin on the top and the bottom. So if we save, refresh, you can see it just spaced our form out from our title and our table. And we're also going to use a form inline so that we can have our form inline like this when we start applying all of the rest of our Bootstrap classes. Now, the very first thing we're going to do, which seems a little weird, is we're actually going to hide this label and only allow it to be read by screen readers. So if we apply a class here, which is equal to SR only, this means this will be screen reader only. And if we refresh, you can see it's disappeared from our page. So it'll only be read by people using screen readers, and people that aren't using screen readers just will not see it. And that means that for our input, we want to make sure we have a placeholder here, which says URL. And if we refresh, that way people know that this text box is for entering in a URL. Also, we're going to make this required since we always want to make sure that they enter a URL. And now we can apply some classes to this input here. And let's just shrink down our side page so we have more room to work with our HTML. And the classes I want to apply are form control, and I want to apply a little bit of margin on the right of 2. Let's save that and refresh. Now the last thing to do is to style this button. We're just going to put button and button success. That'll give us a green colored button. If we refresh, you can see we have that green button there. And if our screen size becomes large enough, then we're going to have our form side by side like this. Let's actually just zoom out so we can see that when we have more room with our HTML. And in order to make it so our URL text box fills the entire width, we just want to apply a class of column to it. So we're just going to say col here. And if we refresh, that now forces this URL to take up the full width no matter what. Now with that out of the way, our form is taken care of, and we don't have to worry about it wrapping onto a new line. It'll always be on the same line. And now we can work on styling out our table, which in Bootstrap is very straightforward. We just want to apply a class of table and table striped. And if we save, refresh over here, you can see we have a nice looking table. And we can even apply the class of table responsive. And if we refresh, that's just going to allow us to scroll across our table on small screen sizes like this. And as you can see, that's working pretty well. And we can expand this if we want to make it easier to read everything inside of our HTML. And that's all the styling we're going to do for this. It's just really basic styling. I just wanted to throw it in here so it didn't look completely ugly. Now the next thing to work on is actually going to be our post request for our form, which is going to allow us to actually create new short URLs. So the action we're going to use for that is just /short URLs. So we're going to post to this short URLs endpoint, and then let's actually create that endpoint here. We can just do an app.post. And if you remember right, that is short URLs. Make sure we start that with a slash like that. And this is again going to take a request and a response. And in here, we actually want to connect to our database and save a new short URL. So we need to set up our database connection. And if you remember, we used a library, which we imported earlier, which is called mongoose. So we're just going to make sure we require that library now. We can just do that by requiring mongoose. And in here, we can actually connect to our database. So to do that, we need to call the function, which is called mongoose.connect. And we need to pass it in the URL for this database. So for our local database, we can use MongoDB :localhost / and then we just put whatever we want to call this database. I'm just going to call it URL Shortener. Shortener, just like that. And then we can pass it some setup options. By default, we're going to want to pass it the options of use new URL parser, set that to true, and also use unified topology. And we're going to set that to true as well. This just allows us to not have to worry about any deprecation warnings, because as you'll see, if I remove this and I save, you can see that I get these deprecation warnings down here. And that's because we are using a certain version of MongoDB and Mongoose, so it expects us to have this use unified topology true. And if I save, you see those warnings are still appearing, so let's see what they say is wrong. We scroll all the way up, you can see it says Mongo parse array invalid connection string. And it looks like I forgot to add the slashes here for our MongoDB connection. Now if I save, you can see we no longer have errors. If we refresh our page, everything is working fine, no errors. So we know that this connection is working as we want it to. So now we need to create a model that is going to store all of our short URL information. So let's just create a folder called models. And inside this folder, we're going to create a file called shorturl.js. Whoops, make sure I spell that correctly. JS, there we go. And in here, we want to again require mongoose. So we're going to do mongoose equals require mongoose, just like that. And then what we can do is actually create a schema. So we can set a variable which is called our short URL schema. And we're going to set that equal to mongoose.schema. We want to create a new one of these. So we'll say new mongoose schema. And this actually takes just an object, which is going to be all of our different columns for our database. And inside of here, we're going to have a full URL, a short URL, and then the number of times we've clicked. So our first property is going to be full, and then we're going to set some options for this. For example, this is going to be a type of string, so we can use type equal to string, and it's going to be required true. So make sure we say required true. And essentially this full is the name of the column in our database. And then this is just the type of that column and whether or not that column is required. Let's do the same thing for the short version of our URL. The type is going to be string and the required is going to be true. But we need some way to generate a short version of the URL because our form only has one URL to enter. But we need to actually generate a short URL to use. So to do that, we're going to use a library called short ID. So let's close out of here. And we're just going to npm I short ID. And this is a library that is very simple. All it does is create a unique short identifier. So let's import that. We can say short ID is equal to require of short ID. And this has a single function inside of it that we're worried about, which is short ID.generate. And this function just generates a short ID for us. So in order to use that with our short column here, we can actually specify a default and we pass it a function. And this function is going to run as the default value for our short column. And we can just say short ID.generate. And since this .generate is a function, this is essentially the same thing as passing it a value like this. It's just going to automatically run our generate function for us. So we don't need to worry about wrapping it in its own function. So now every time we create a new short URL, it'll generate this short ID here and save it in our short column. The last thing we need to do is our clicks. So what we can do is just our type here, set to number. We obviously want to make sure that this is required. So we'll say required true. And our default for this one is just going to be a value of 0. Always we want to start with 0 clicks on our short URL. That just obviously makes sense. And lastly, we actually need to export this. So we'll say module.exports is equal to mongoose.model, which is a function that takes the name of our model, which in our case is short URL, and it takes the schema, which is our short URL schema. So this is actually what kind of hooks up our database and our actual model that you can see that we created here. So now we can affect our database from within our model. Let's just save that. And now go into our server. We can get our short URL, short URL, and we can just require that file. And if we start with /, that's going to be all of our local files. We can go models and short URL. So now we have our short URL being imported, and in our post, we can actually create a new one. So what we can say is short URL.create, and all we want to do is pass in that full value, which is full, and we know we can get our body values by saying request.body, and this is going to give us access to our form. And if we check in our EJS file, we have a name set on this of full URL, so we want to just access the full URL property of our body. And in order to get this to properly work with Express, we actually need to tell our app that we're using URL parameters. So we're going to say app.use express.url encoded, and this takes a single object, and all we want to do is set the extended property to false. It's required that we pass in either true or false here. Either one, it doesn't matter for our use case. And now if we save, we're able to actually create a new short URL here. One thing to note though is this is asynchronous action. It actually happens in the background, and we want to make sure we wait until this is finished executing. So we can just create an async function. We'll make this asynchronous, and then we'll just use the await keyword here to say we want to wait for this to finish creating before we move on. And if you're not familiar with async await, I have an entire video covering it in the cards and the description. Now the last thing we want to do is just redirect our user back to our home page, this index page here. So what we're doing essentially is we're just creating a new short URL and then redirecting us back to the home page. So now let's try that out. Let's just refresh our page to make sure everything works. And you can see we're getting an error. We just need to make sure we rerun our site. So npm run dev start. Once that gets started up, we can now refresh, as you can see. And let's try a new URL. We'll say https://courses.webdevsimplified.com. And if we typed in shrink, you can see everything executed, but our URLs aren't showing up yet. So inside of our get here, we actually want to make our URLs show up. So we can call short URL.find, and this is going to get all of the URLs inside of our short URL table. So we can just say short URLs is going to be equal to awaiting that function. We'll just make sure that this is an async function so that we can use await. Then we can pass those short URLs down into our view by just passing like this an object with short URLs like this. And then in our index file, we can actually loop through every single short URL. So what we want to do is take our short URLs, we want to loop through each one of them. So for each short URL, we want to run this function here. And let's just make sure we end off these brackets and create brackets around these closing ones as well. And then we're just going to copy this code because we're going to essentially use this exact row syntax, but we're going to replace these hrefs that we manually set by using the hrefs from our short URL. So we can say short URL.full because this first column is for our full information. And we're also going to set the text of our anchor, same exact thing. And then this one is going to be for our, in here, short URL dot short. Let's make sure we close that off. And again, we're just going to copy this and paste this into this section here. And then lastly, for our clicks, we're going to do the same exact thing, short URL.clicks. And we're going to close that off. And let's just make sure all of our syntax looks correct. We have opening and closing brackets for all of these. This one's opening, closing, opening, closing, opening, closing, opening. This closing one is backwards though, so let's make sure we have here. And now all of our syntax should be good. So now if we save and refresh, you can see that this is actually updated to have our normal courses URL. And this has the auto-generated short URL that we created, and then our clicks. But obviously, when we click our short URL, this isn't going to work. It says cannot get this weird short URL. So in order to fix this issue, we need to create yet another route. And the important thing to do is make sure this route comes at the very bottom of all of our other routes. So we're going to say app.get, and what we want to do is get anything that has a value here. So we're just going to call this short URL. So essentially what this is saying is give me any route that has information directly after the first slash. So here, directly after the first slash, we have this text, and this is going to be saved in a parameter called short URL. And then we can do the same thing, request response. And while we're at it, we're just going to make this an async function as well. And inside of here, we can use request.param.short URL. And this is actually going to be whatever we pass here, this short URL inside of our URL up here. So we can just actually use short URL, our model. We can call the .find1. And all we want to do is we want to find one based on that short property. So whenever the short property equals short URL, we want to actually find that model. So we can say our short URL is going to be equal to awaiting this function. And if we take a quick look at this, what's happening is we're just calling the find1 method on our database, passing it in our search query, which is just saying we want to find whichever one has this short ID, which is passed in from our URL, and then we're going to save it to this variable. Now, sometimes people are going to pass a URL that doesn't exist, so we want to check for that. We can just say if short URL is equal to, null, then we just want to return res.send status of 404, essentially saying we cannot find what you're looking for. Otherwise, if we do have what they're looking for, we have a short URL here, and we can take the clicks on it and add one. Essentially, they've clicked on this, so we want to update that click counter by adding one. And then we want to make sure we call the save function to update our short URL with this new clicks value. Then lastly, we can call res.redirect, and we're actually going to pass it in our short URL.full. So essentially, we passed in the short URL, we appended one to the clicks, and then what we're doing is getting the full URL and redirecting our user to wherever that happens to be. So now let's save, and if we refresh our browser on this, we should get redirected to my course page. And of course, that didn't quite work as intended, so let's take another look over here. And I notice immediately that I spelled this param wrong. It should be request.params instead, because we want to search through all of our params. And now if I save and I refresh this, we should get redirected to my course page. And as you can see, it redirected us to my course page. Now let's go back here. Obviously, we want to be on our local host 5000, just like this. And let's create another one. We'll go to my blog, for example. We'll say https blog.webdevsimplified.com. And if we click shrink, you can see that shows up down here. We have our short URL, and you even notice our clicks on this short URL that we've already used has been incremented by 1. And now let's just open this in a new tab, and you can see it's redirected me to my blog by using that short URL instead of having to use the entire long URL. Now the very last thing to do is we want to create a file over here called .getignore. ignore, just like that. And we want to make sure we ignore our node modules. And the reason we're doing this is if you ever deploy this site using Git or GitHub or something like that, you don't want to send all of these node modules up to your server for Git and GitHub. You just want to send up this package.json, which handles downloading all of those files for you. So with this git ignore, we're just ignoring that folder so we don't have to worry about saving it to our GitHub repository or whatever repository you use. And that's all there is to creating this amazing URL shortener. If you enjoyed this video, you can check out some of my other project-based videos linked over here and subscribe to the channel for more videos just like this one. Thank you very much for watching and have a good day.